Good morning from Singapore, and welcome to the Perspective on COVID-19, Asia and the World webinar, organized by Vietnam Finance Society, or VFS. I am Lê Trường Giang, a Singapore-based analyst at Global Risk Consultancy Control Risk Group. On behalf of VFS, I would like to send our gratitude to our audience, as well as our sincere best wish during this challenging time, no matter where you are. Before I proceed to our agenda and guest speaker, allow me a few words about VFS and our missions. VFS is a member-run US-registered organization committed to build a strong community of Vietnamese professionals. We have two main objectives. First, to provide forum for the exchange of information and promotion of thought leadership among Vietnamese professionals. And second, to provide mentorship, leadership development, and continuing education for younger generations of Vietnamese to maximize their opportunity for career success. As we help Vietnamese diaspora in North America, Europe, and Asia to stay connected with each other and with Vietnam, we have set up partnerships with other similar organizations, maintain relationships with Vietnamese and foreign companies, and build a referral network for internship and job opportunity. We also organize networking events, meet and greet with companies and executives, as well as topic focus series, the latter of which is our event today. Now to our webinar. We are living through an unprecedented time as countries and businesses all continue to grapple with the coronavirus and profound consequences of widespread lockdown. Unemployment has surged, demand plummeted, trade, supply chain, and investment have taken a nosedive. In the next 1.5 hours, I will speak to 3 speakers to provide analysis on how bad things will get to the interconnected Asian economies, and what will it take to get the region's countries and companies back on track. Our first speaker, Dr. Nguyen, Senior Lecturer at the University of Sydney Central Clinical School, will offer insight and perspective from a healthcare angle. Our second speaker, Ms. Lê Thuy Trang, Vice President at Australian Multinational Investment Bank Macquarie Group, will look at the macroeconomic and development, as well as outlook for businesses and foreign investors. Lastly, Dereck Aw, Senior Analyst at Global Risk Consultancy Control Risk, will evaluate Asia's risk of political destabilizations and the region's geopolitical change. Overall, we aim to shed further light on 3 key areas. Number 1, how the pandemic may end and how soon. Number 2, the growth outlook for Asia. And number 3, on whether COVID-19 will be a turning point for geopolitical changes that are difficult to fathom, but will shape Asia in the years to come. There are 3 parts in our agenda. We will spend the first 30 to 40 minutes discussing the progress of COVID-19, its impact on Asia, and the ways which Asian governments have responded. Our speaker will then address a couple of open-ended questions on the future outlook for around 20 to 30 minutes. Whatever remaining time we have will be dedicated to Q&A. During our discussions, please write your question in Zoom Q&A functions, and we will prioritize those with the most upvote. And now allow me to begin our webinar with Thuy. As the world scrambles to understand COVID-19 and its implications, there is a constellation of assumptions about the virus that are embedded in, say, the public perceptions, in government calculation to whether open the economy, or analysts like me when judging a country outlook. Assumptions such as warm summer weather can ration the pandemic, or people that are infected with COVID-19 will develop a response that has a certain level of protection against it. Thank you for joining us from Hanoi, Thuy. You have more than two decades of experiences in epidemiology, and your research has focused on the detection and treatment of some of the deadliest diseases. If you explain to people in general, would you tell them that we now know that the coronavirus is more deadly, less deadly, more transmittable, less transmittable? How do you categorize this one?
Thank you, Giang, for your question. And before giving my opinion about the topic, I want to thank VFS for inviting me to this exciting webinar. We know many things about SARS-CoV-2, and we don't know many things about SARS-CoV-2. That's the fact that we have to live with it now. We know that SARS-CoV-2 can transmit from human to human. It's pretty easy to transmit through close contact, through droplet. And we have seen number of people infected with SARS-CoV-2 in the world increasing rapidly. In the last few days, the curve seems to be flattened, but still it's increasing in many other new and developing countries. How deadly the virus is a big question to answer, because if you follow the data reported worldwide, you will see that the death rate in different countries is different. It depends on how each country define and report deaths. As we can see that some countries suddenly report a very high number of deaths in certain days because they change the definition of those who death with the symptoms suspected of COVID-19 won't be categorized as COVID-19 related deaths. But some countries only report people who have confirmed deaths to be COVID-19 related deaths. Even the number of people infected with SARS-CoV-2 is also reported differently in different countries. Countries with the high coverage of testing will be able to find more cases, but countries who test less cannot find many cases, therefore the death rate is high. So at this moment, what we need is to have a community-based survey to clearly define how many people infected with SARS-CoV-2 out there and how many people death, even how many people in a severe condition. We need to have such accurate data, but in general, so far, we know that about 80% of infected people are in mild condition and 20% are in moderate or severe conditions.
Thank you very much. One data point I would like to hear your assessment about is that many studies performed in the US have found that the actual number of infection far exceeds the number of confirmed cases. For example, antibody tests in Miami-Dade County, Florida found that the actual number of infection cases may be 16 times more than official case total. New York, 10 times, Los Angeles, 28 to 55 times, Santa Clara, California, 50 to 80 times more. What is your assessment of this number?
Well, to me, it's not a surprise because we know that COVID-19, about some study estimated that about 40 to 50% of people have no symptoms. Therefore, it is very likely that we underdetect the number of cases in those countries. So the reported numbers will be very low compared to the actual infected number. But another issue is that the current antibody test is not as accurate as we hope. So there could be a false positive people reported in the pool that may indicate a overestimation of number of people infected in those locations compared to the actual number. I mean, I know that I do not give a clear answer, because there's so many uncertainty in this world about this pandemic. And that's the reason why the scientists have to work better on developing a more accurate antibody test and a better method of measurement of the infection in the community. But one of the findings that we all clear is that the number of reported infected cases is underestimated.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. Now let's move to a topic that I'm sure just everyone in the world care about right now, medical solutions to COVID-19. With the number of coronavirus infection now past the 3 million mark, the pressure is growing to come up with therapies and vaccine to combat with the contagions. And dozens of companies around the world are pursuing either, among them like Sanofi, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna. Now, Dr. Thuy, can you please walk us through the development process for the current development process for a COVID-19 vaccine and treatment?
Yeah, I'm going to share with you a brief presentation to walk us through the development of vaccine candidates and drug candidates. But I cannot share my screen, so if anyone can help me with that.
Vũ, can you?
Well, I'm not allowed to share my screen.
You are on mute. Okay. You are on mute. So can you help Thuy share the screen?
If not, I can just talk.
So you are the host now, and you can share the screen.
Okay. Sorry. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, I need to move this off. Okay, first I'm going to talk about the development of vaccine candidate, which we all hope that could cure the world. Since 11 January 2020, the group of Chinese scientists was able to sequencing the genetic of the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then since then, all the scientists in the world are racing to develop vaccine. And so far, we have around 120 vaccine candidates by the report on 30th of April this year. Although 94 candidates is in preclinical stage, and 5 candidates is in phase 1 clinical trial, which means that those candidates is testing in a small groups of people. And there's 3 candidates in the phase 2, which is testing in the larger group from 100 to 1,000 people. And in order to have a vaccine to be used in the community, in people like us, the vaccine has to go through phase 3 clinical trial, which means it has to be tested in thousands of people in different locations, in Asia, in US, in European countries. And once the result is positive, then it has to go through a complicated procedure to get approval, to be manufactured to meet global needs, to be able to distribute to different countries, to people who are in need, and to have been in the quality control process. And this table lists 8 vaccine candidates, which is in the phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. And what is new is in the past, you can see that different vaccine has been developed in a very long time, 10 years, 20 years, even longer. So can we hope that the vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 will be developed in a short period? which is very interesting question. But thanks to the development of science, we now see that a different platform was used to develop the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. For example, the first two in phase 2 clinical trial use non-replicate viral vectors, which means that it provides a protein expression much better. The vaccine is stable in the long term and it may produce strong immune response. Another vaccine, the third one and the seventh one use DNA or RNA platform to be developed, and it offers a more flexible antigen manipulation in the people who is vaccinated. And with the platform, we hope that the vaccine could be developed in a very short time. But even if we have a vaccine in clinical trial phase 3, successfully tested, then when should we expect to have a vaccine? I think that perhaps by the first or second quarter of 2021, we will have a new vaccine if we are lucky. But this year is not likely that we will have it. But the question is, even when the vaccine is approved, how it gets into different countries to people who are in need. Because we have 7 billion people on Earth, we need to have a huge manufacturing plant and infrastructure to meet a global demand. We need to have a system to distribute to different countries, and not every country have appropriate infrastructure to receive the vaccines and use the vaccine in a optimal condition. And even when the vaccine get into the country need to prepare infrastructure, human and financial resources, as well as procurement and supply chain mechanism to disperse to people safely, equally, and also monitor the safety even when the vaccine is used. So we have a long road to go ahead. Another issue that I want to raise in this slide is you can see this slide indicates that there are many companies or agencies developing vaccine in the world at this moment. And most of the company or agency is in North America. In Asia, Australia, not including China, there's more number of agencies. And among those, most of them are private industry. And you can see that even when the vaccine is available, we'll have to think about the price of the vaccine, how it is affordable to developing countries. One of the issues with the COVID-19 pandemic is that we cannot be healthy alone, right? We have to be healthy together. If vaccine can be reached to rich country, but not to developing country, still we'll have to deal with the same problem. So that's for the vaccine. How about drug? At this moment, no therapeutic agents licensed for COVID-19 treatment. There's about 500 clinical trials is underway, and we hope that by April to December this year, I mean now it's May, so we have some preliminary results. We have some results on clinical trial. And although clinical trial try to give answer to 4 questions, whether the drug will help to prevent mortality in COVID-19 patients, will the drug reduce hospitalization duration in the patient, will it help us to not have to be in ventilation or intensive care, or will there be a prophylaxis drug for high-risk people? So what we have out there, this list of key drugs that are in clinical trial at this moment, and remdesivir is candidate number 1 that we all heard about. The other drug, lopinavir, is a HIV antiviral drug that has been used widely in the HIV community, but early, think in March, there was a clinical trial proof that the drug is not effective in treating COVID-19. Chloroquine raised a lot of debate. Favipiravir also is in the clinical trial. Plasma transfusion has been using in some country and is in clinical trial. And I have a link here if you want to look at the full list of the drug is under investigation. So let's talk about the most promising candidate, remdesivir. Have to move my, okay. So remdesivir in 29th April this year, there was a press release or announcement from NIH on their ACTT trial in which they use remdesivir in over 1,000 hospitalized patients in 47 hospitals in not only US, but also in European countries and Asian countries. And what they found is the recovery time declines from 15 days to 11 days. And there could be an effect on survival rate. Those who are on remdesivir, the death rate is 8%, and though on placebo is 11.6%, although the difference is not statistically different, but still it indicates some effect on survival. However, the study needs to be reviewed carefully, and we haven't seen the detailed result on this study. Another trial also showed that 5 days treatment have similar improvement compared to 10-day treatment. And then the last one is done by the group in Wuhan, also shows some recovery time declines, but not statistically different. And in my opinion, we need more evidence to say if remdesivir is effectiveness or not.
Understand. Thank you very much. One last question for you in this part. As you may already know, on Friday, May 2nd, which is yesterday for us in Asia, the US regulator at the Federal Drug Administration has cleared remdesivir for emergency use in COVID-19 patients. This is the first medication backed by early clinical data to be made available to fight this coronavirus. What is your assessment of this, given that, like from your slide, this treatment is not yet under peer review, and on data available is still in early stage? Like, what do you make of this decision by the FDA, by the US FDA?
Well, I think that this is a promising drug, but I'm a scientist, so I'm pretty conservative because we want to have a drug that is good for people and do not have a side effect on patient. And we want to have an evidence that show a clear, effective on the patient. And I would prefer to have been able to look at the detailed data. And that sounds promising for people who are not in medical science. If you are on medical science, you can see that the recovery time declines from 15 days to 11 days. Well, what does it mean? You have 4 days shorter in the sick time period. That is, of course, it helps with the reduction of hospitalized duration and may help to reduce the burden on healthcare system. But what does it mean to individuals? We don't know. Another issue is I would really wish that clinical trial could try this drug on a mild patient so that they would develop a more severe condition and they don't have to go to hospital or hospitalization. And the death is not related to COVID-19, but related to many other diseases that when we have a viral infection, early treatment is always work better than later treatment. So
Okay.
what I mean is I'm still prefer to see the detailed result
Mm.
before drawing any conclusions.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. Uh, Now we will now move on to some macroeconomic and investment topic with Trang, who will offer insight from her experience observing and analyzing Asian economy at Macquarie Group and previously at global financial services firm Credit Suisse. Thank you for joining us from Hong Kong, Trang.
Thanks.
Um, mm, well, well, although China has managed to contain the spread of the coronavirus, the majority of developing Asia are still reporting increased incidence of the virus. And the drastic quarantine measure adopted across the region are taking a toll on local economy. Now, a majority of Asian economies are dependent on export demand, tourism, and remittances. Given that all are in a downward trend due to the pandemic, first, can you give us an overview of how bad things are and are expected to be? And second, which countries, which Asian countries do you expect to be most at risk of entering a prolonged recession?
Okay. So first of all, thanks Dan for inviting us to this very exciting presentation, and thanks Chi Thuy for a very insightful presentation. I learned a lot more about the drugs and the treatment available at this stage. It's really bad when you look at the economic consequence of this outbreak. From a global perspective, what we are looking is a worst global recession or the worst global contraction since 1930s, the Great Depressions of 1930s. Just for perspective, IMF estimated global GDP growth will contract about 3% this year. And for comparison, during the GFC in 2008-2009, global GDP still managed a modest growth rate of 1%. So we are ways worse. And the nature of the crisis is also very different because it's brought about because of a public health crisis, which means that current government stimulus was not very helpful when people are stuck at home and businesses are shut. So that the slowdown itself is brought about by government closures, and so a lot of how severe is the recessions, how we get on from here. A lot of it will depend on the pathway of the outbreak itself. Whether we get a containment, as we are seeing early evidence so far, and a slow ease of lockdown or social distancing measure, allowing economic recovery in the second half. And considering that we are in a very low base this year, if we can get to that scenario, then that means that next year we are likely to see above trend growth. So global growth could rise to about 5 to even 6% in that scenario. However, in a scenario where we face with either a second wave of infections or repeated lockdown or closures, then there would be risk of a prolonged recessions. In terms of impact on Asia economies, it really depends on what happened externally, because I would say that currently government in Asia is doing a relatively good job in managing the local outbreak in their countries, and I'm talking about relatively larger emerging Asia countries. So if externally the US enter a prolonged recessions, then the likelihood is that all major Asia economies would have to, feel the pain as well. But if the US economy can manage a recovery in the second half as per our base case, then Asia could, given we starting with a relatively favorable demographic structures and growth potential, we are likely to see above trend growth recovery in Asia as well. In the short term, countries that are exposed to, as you said, tourism, remittances, are likely to be hit more. For example, Thailand, who's already facing structural growth slowdown. However, again, it really is a question of, if and when we can get over with the outbreak, and if external demand recovery, we should see growth resuming in most of the Asia countries next year. And China does offer a relatively supportive case for us to be optimistic, because after China data collapsed in January and February due to the government lockdown in China, we are seeing high frequency indicators like coal, power consumptions, footprints, transportations picking up and gradually resuming a normalization process. So in March, industrial production in China has already sort of go back to 80% of the level before the outbreak hit in early January. That in that sense, we would expect a lot of the Asia countries to follow the same path, provided that the outbreak can be contained.
One question, can we expect the Chinese consumer and producer to bail other Asian economies out?
It's $100 million question. The issue is that China itself has already faced structural issues going into this crisis. So even before this, China growth was on a slowdown trend. So for example, in Q4 of last year, China GDP has already reported, slowest growth rate in like 30 years. And we continue to expect China growth to trend down due to various issues from demographic structures to high debt burdens and difficulties for the banking system to tune out credit, given that it already had relatively high non-performing loans. So at the moment, China is a much bigger economy than it was in early 2000s or 2008. So even though it's growing at a slower rate, the net GDP creation is still significant for global growth. So it's still going to be a significant growth driver. But for it to bail out the world, it would require a significant step up in China fiscal and monetary stimulus. And at the moment, the way that we read the Chinese policymakers, there is no sign yet that they have picked up stimulus in the way that they did in 2008 and 2009. So they have done a number of things, including, potentially expanding fiscal deficit, increase special government bond issuance for infrastructures. But our view is that it's probably not enough yet until they go to a more bazooka options, in the sense that they just pumping in money and doing a lot more infrastructure investment. China is cautious of the potential side effect, because obviously it means that they will accumulate a lot more debt that is, potentially not very good debt in a sense, not very repayable debt, and they are cautious of the negative impact from that. So they are proceeding cautiously.
Understood. Here's a tough question, and I would like Dereck to join in this question as well. So, policy constraints from the US-China trade deal. Do you think that will divert trade demand that may have recovered amid the normalization of Chinese economic activity? Because we expect China, do you expect China to strive to honor its purchase commitment under the first phase of the US-China deal? This would necessitate the rerouting of trade flow from other trading partners towards the US, right? And may negatively affect agriculture for Australia and New Zealand, energy for Indonesia, machinery from Japan, automotive from Japan and South Korea. So, Trang and Dereck, do you expect that China will honor its commitment to purchase US-made goods?
Well, perhaps I jump in first, and I would say so far it has fallen short due to difficulties in the own situations onshore, given the lockdown in January and February. So China purchase of US agricultures and oil and gas have fallen short of the promise in the phase one trade deal. Of course, China has expressed a willingness to step up and continue to stick to the target for now. But we have said before that that target, even without the COVID outbreak, was quite aggressive or was quite optimistic to start with, and it would imply China having to import from the US having to rise about 60%, 60, from the level 2-3 years back, and that is very, very challenging. And as you said, it will lead to trade divergence and disruptions to a few other suppliers. The question for it is really how the US would react. Would the US take it easy and say, okay, I mean, obviously China faced with an unprecedented, or global faced with an unprecedented health crisis, and that should allow some leeway for the purchase? Or if the US want to go the aggressive way and say, okay, you have fallen short of your commitment and we may need to apply further tariffs on you. The second scenario would have a much, much more significant drag on global economy, and the US would have to think carefully to go down that route, because it implies that you are adding a further challenge to already the weakest global economies in 100 years. So whether you would want to drag everyone else, including yourself, in a deeper recession because of that, or give some leeway for China to step up its purchase as long as it's on a reasonable path towards the commitment.
Thank you so much, Dereck. Would you like to add additional insights?
Yeah, well, I agree completely with everything that Chang has explained. But what I will add is that I think the worst is not over, for US-China tensions. That's regardless of who wins in the November elections in the US. Even if it's Joe Biden, we could expect, the chronic tensions that we've seen over the past few years to resurface again. It is increasingly likely that there will be back and forths over the next few months, and that there's no respite for that kind of thing. I think also that the U.S. elections would really the dynamics around it during the campaign period would also bring would exacerbate rather these tensions. So those things are what we're watching and what we expect as well.
Thank you, Dereck. One last question for you, Chang, in this part. Which sector do you think would feel most keenly the impact of the pandemic? We are focusing on Asia here, so obviously in the Asian context.
Yeah, I guess, naturally, the sector that's worst hit is travel and tourism related or hospitality related, given international travel is completely shut down. And this is the case for all countries, but some Asia economies like Thailand and Philippines relied particularly on this, including Vietnam as well, as a source of dollar revenues. And the way that we need to measure contribution of tourism to GDP is not simply the direct contribution, but also the indirect contribution, that is other sectors serving this tourism related industry. So all of those are likely to feel the pain. The second subset is services facing sectors. It could be restaurants, shops, entertainment, because people are restricted in terms of their movement and because of the lockdown. And even when lockdown measures are eased, the likelihood is that until we get a treatment or a vaccination, people will still try to reduce their social interactions, and that could affect the structural behavior changes that could affect services facing sector. Of course, there would be winners as well, or the sector that benefit from the COVID outbreak. The trend that we already see in Asia is moving towards e-commerce, starting from China, but certainly broadening across the region. And the COVID outbreak will certainly accelerate the development of various e-commerce platforms. The other is data centers, working from home. I mean, we are all now get accustomed to working from home. Excuse me. I think it could go into a state of the world where companies realize that they don't need a fixed space, an office for everyone. And we could get into like flexible office arrangement where you just, book your seat the day before, for example, bring your laptop to work and then bring it back. So there's a lot of opportunities being created as well. And of course, healthcare. Healthcare is an area where government globally are likely to pour in a lot of money from now and until after the outbreak. And that's not only, direct like hospital staff training, etc., but also indirect like the suppliers, provider of medical equipment, etc. Pharmaceuticals, development, R&D, those are likely to see a significant boost.
Understood. Thank you very much, Chicha, for your insight. And now let's move to discuss some geopolitical and political risk with Dereck, who has lots of experience analyzing Asia's political and regulatory landscape at country risk, and previously as a British embassy in Manila. While the pandemic has disrupted supply chains and financial system and hurt investor sentiment, it has also potentially serious political implications. Dereck has been focusing on the assessment of fresh wave of political instability that this healthcare and economic crisis has caused in an already volatile region. So Dereck, let's talk about social stability at risk. We know that government measures to contain the pandemic have and will disproportionately affect the working class, especially those in the informal sector that are abundant in Asian countries. What is your general assessment of the risk to social stability in Asia? And which Asian countries do you consider to be most exposed to destabilizing factors such as backlashes against policymakers, wide-scale default on private debt, or a partial collapse of the private sector?
Sure. I think it would be very clear that the worst effects from this pandemic would come from the government measures that are necessary to contain them. I'm talking about lockdowns, I'm talking about travel restrictions, movement restrictions that are affecting business as well as work. I would look at Indonesia, the Philippines, Bangladesh as probably the top countries for those kind of risks. I would throw India into the fray, but it seems like I was talking to my colleague who covers India, and it seems like it's much more under control than we first expected earlier. To give you an example, if you look at Manila, the capital of the Philippines, you're looking at 1 million people being estimated to go to experience severe hunger if this lockdown persists beyond this month, beyond May. 100, that's about 10% of the population of the capital. And if that does happen, that would be a huge issue for the government. I would force the government to probably take decisions prioritizing security rather than public health or the economy. That would be very, very bad for the economy if it does happen. I think in terms of the pandemic, like the demographics in these places, Indonesia, India, Philippines, Bangladesh, they're pretty good. For example, I'm 31 years old, and for the Philippines, I would say that about 75% of the country, of the population, is younger than me. That would mean that there would be more ratio of asymptomatic people or people experiencing milder symptoms and much less likely to die from this virus. So the pandemic itself is not the worry, it's the measures against it. I would also focus on the fact that the government or public sector represents only about 5% of the economy for the Philippines and Indonesia. That's in comparison to the US, where it's 40%, and the UK and most European countries somewhere in the middle, closer to like 20-30%. It would be very challenging for these countries to ramp up the state sector in such a way that would fill gaps in demand and supply over the coming months, and we should expect that they would at some point, especially for the Philippines and Indonesia, at some point they would acknowledge that this virus is just impossible to suppress it's impossible for them to achieve what countries like Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan were able to achieve. And they would prioritize the economy. They would say, let's reopen, let's restart the economy, parts of it, let's see what happens. So I think in these countries, we would face a future of bouncing in and out of lockdown. I think Trang Thuy has mentioned that earlier as her second scenario. In that case, I don't think the business would restart in these places. I don't think anyone would invest or would start or would commit to any outlays if you're only 6-8 weeks until the next restrictions are introduced again. So it's very challenging for these places. It's more a crisis of governance rather than anything, and that would be a concern in the coming months for the greater region.
Understood. Thank you, Dereck. That's for the political destabilization risk within a country. Now let's look at geopolitical, because the coronavirus crisis has led to a further deterioration in the already chronically bad relationship between China and the US. I know we just discussed somewhat of this question before, but what is your assessment on the damages so far to the US-China relationship? And what is the prospect, if any, that those damages could be repaid in the short to medium term?
Yeah, so yes, I think that the biggest thing is that there's an election coming up in less than 6 months, and in the US rather. And I think that's the biggest COVID-related risk globally in the coming year. Again, I'm not talking about who wins, either between Biden and Trump, there will be chronic tension between the US and China. I'm talking about probably the most, we've never faced such a prospect that the US elections would probably be contested on grounds of tampering or procedural flaws, or probably low turnout because of fear of this pandemic. You would see Joe Biden, I think, through a tweet, I believe, saying that, mark my words, the US elections will be delayed. Trump will delay the elections rather. That's going to be a huge problem. I think, I think countries like China could take advantage of that kind of situation. I don't know, it's unprecedented. I don't think anyone knows how long that sort of scenario would last if it does happen. That's probably one of the biggest risks, or the biggest risk that's brought about by this pandemic globally. I also think that China, in terms of Chinese reaction to this, I think they obviously was the first to experience this and also went the first to come out of this. And we've seen in Southeast Asia that they have tried to take advantage of that position of being the first. We've seen them testing Malaysia before it was, they would send that oil rig around Vietnam and Philippines, but now they're testing Malaysia. And the reaction from the US, or at the very least, the US military was pretty decisive. They sent a couple of destroyers over there. And it was, it does show that the US military, regardless of what's going on more broadly, would remain committed to containing China in this region. But going forward, there are, no consensus in what China would do. There's a school of thought that would say that during times like this, China would try to distract the domestic public by being more adventurous. By pursuing adventurism abroad. But I think I'm more of the second school of thought, which says that I think, President Xi Jinping has never faced a greater crisis of legitimacy, I think, in his entire career. And I think the tendency would be towards more conservative foreign policy. That is to say, the Belt and Road Initiative would probably be less ambitious and focus more on projects that would bring about more strategic advantages. I'm thinking Myanmar, more than Malaysia, that kind of thing. But also I think, like the wag the dog type thinking won't really be the best, most rational way forward for the Chinese leadership. I mean, but even now, there's even talks of Wang Qishan, trying to shake things up within the core group in the party, and I think that would lead the top level leadership to take more conservative actions going forward. But going back to U.S. China, I think another thing to look at is the expansion or spillover of this tension towards the financial markets. And I think Trang Thuy could comment maybe after or more on that. But there are now, I mean, Donald Trump Jr., the son of the president, who obviously is not a key decision maker in the government, tweeted something to the effect of threatening to seize U.S. Treasury bonds from China and so on and so forth. And I think there will be more talks of that in the coming weeks, and that's probably going to be devastating as well. So it's looking very bad to answer your question. It doesn't seem like it's something that would resolve these tensions are not something that would resolve in the coming by this year. And the pandemic has probably just exacerbated these existing trends.
Got it. Thank you so much.
I would add on my end, in terms of, potential measures that have been flagged in the media recently by the US that they could potentially punish China via either trade tariffs, cancellations of US debt, that is, treasuries that China government is holding, which is most estimate about at least $1 trillion US, along with, other measures like to target certain sector or certain tech sector, etc. To me, I feel the cancellation of debt is probably the last option, and US treasuries are likely to be severely against it because it is likely to affect US government debt credibility. And like it or not, the rating agencies, even though that the US government will be at pain if they ever go there to stress that this is very specific, this is unprecedented, and it would never happen again. But once you have a template, everyone is still worried that it could potentially happen. And the rating agency would have to take that into account in terms of US credit ratings. And for countries where its debt pile continues to grow and rely extremely on the fact that dollar is a global funding currencies and dollar is a global reserves currencies, going that far is probably more damaging to the US and China itself. And it will probably accelerate the process of China decoupling from the US economically by pushing the RMB as a global reserve currencies, by being more aggressive for finding allies across Asia to adapt, a different global settlement and global reserve currencies, and that would, in the very long term, undermine the dollar itself. So I think that would be a move that potentially more destructive to the US and China itself over the long term.
Thank you, Chief Trang and Dereck. There seems to be a lot of great power rivalry ahead of us. In order to make ample time for Q&A sessions, I will ask just two more outlook-oriented questions. One healthcare questions for Dr. Thuy, and one macro and investment questions for Trang and Dereck. Dr. Thuy, this question is probably in everyone's mind right now. How do you judge the risk of second or third wave of the pandemic occurring possibly in the later part of this year with similar lethality? There have been indications that people may not develop immunity even after having recovered from COVID-19. And for those who have developed a protection response, that response may not last for very long, maybe like even disappear after a few months. If this turn out to be true, how would it change your outlook?
Well, I think that it is a very difficult question, but we are likely to see the second wave of the epidemic or even the third wave. I should not say epidemic, but pandemic, which means that it will be heavily hit us in the near future. Even I have just finished my modeling work for Vietnam, and even in the most optimistic scenario, we still see new cases floating around the country. And if we have just one super spreader, you will see a big wave in a very short time, say 1 or 2 weeks, like what we have seen in Singapore or in many other locations in some other countries. And in the past, people often refer to the Spanish influenza pandemic in 1918, 1919. We'll see the same thing with this virus. So we need to be well prepared for the second and the third wave. And your question about antibody, whether it will be there and last for long, the most recent research that I have seen indicate or suggesting that there will be antibody among those who is infected with SARS-CoV-2. But how long it lasts, we need to have more time to answer. That's a very difficult question.
Understood. Thank you very much. And like, I certainly hope that we will learn the answer to the question as soon as possible. Now for Dereck and Trang, thank you. Now for Dereck and Trang, I would like one of you to be the optimist and one of you to be the pessimist here. What is your judgment on the likelihood that economic recessions could extend into 2021? And how about the likelihood that the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy could be smaller than currently anticipated? Trang, like which side, like do you want to be the optimist or the pessimist?
I'm an economist, so one of the characteristics of economists is they want to be both. so we always list the positive and the negatives. But I think I am more on the optimistic side, and the reason why is because we have had unprecedented government stimulus and central bank stimulus this time round. The key reasons why recessions last long, like the 1930 depressions, or even in the early part of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, is that government has been slow to react. But this time around, government has learned it the hard way, and we are seeing government stepping up fiscal stimulus aggressively. So again, quoting IMF, they calculated that global fiscal support or fiscal impulse has risen to about 4 to 5% of GDP this time around, whereas in 2008, it was only about 2% of GDP, so more than doubling of the government fiscal responses here. Monetary policy has been even faster. For the Fed, I mean, we have rates cutting to zero and unlimited QE now. And in the past, from the 20th of March to now, the Fed has been buying more treasuries, government securities and credits, etc., at a pace that exceeded its first 1 to 2 years of QE in 2008 and 2009. So government is being very, very responsive to this crisis. The key constraint for them and also a key risk for us is that, usually in a recession scenario, what government will attempt to do is to stimulate aggregate demand, making people spend more, going back to business as much as possible. The problem is the key constraint for us now is it's not possible under lockdown, and it depends on the pathway of the virus. So if the virus get a second wave that require repeated lockdowns, especially in some of the smaller ASEAN economies, that could prove a constraint. Whether we get a prolonged recession is entirely depend on how well the government managed the COVID situation from here. So if I take Korea as an example, it has had to deal with localized outbreak, like for example in dengue, where 60% of the 10,000 cases reported in Korea are actually originated from the church sect in dengue. But even then, there was never a lockdown order in dengue, and they was able to contain the situation by testing a massive amount of populations. The member of the church tested was approaching 10,000 people, and it was done over the short period of time. So I would say, the government has learned hard from their actions, and they will potentially, be able to contain the second and subsequent wave of the outbreak in a better way than they have did the first time.
Thank you, Sita. Dereck, do you have other assessments that are different from Trang?
Sure, I'll make it quick as well. Well, I'll take the slightly pessimistic view, and it's at best we're looking at economies resuming probably 70% or 80% of what we used to have before the pandemic struck. The tourism sector is gone, parts of the services sector is gone. That's going to be very, very hard to replace. We're looking at, as this rare instance of supply and demand shocks that is very, very difficult for the usual set of fiscal and monetary policy reactions to kind of take effect as efficiently as we want them to be. Just for example, to build a car, you need 1,000 parts, and it only takes one part made in China or the Philippines for the entire production process to stop. We've seen that. In fact, I'm working in a few projects involving that. In Vietnam, the Hyundai plant, their biggest in the world, have stopped because they couldn't source a key component from China. It's the same in Japan. So things that, like ASEAN economies are, they represent a small fraction of the global economy, but they're huge. They have huge impact in the supply chains. Some factories in developed world, in industrialized countries have stopped production precisely because of this problem. And I think in the coming months, we would see more regionalization, like a factory in Germany for cars would probably source more from places like Poland rather than China, Philippines, Thailand. We're also seeing localization. I was speaking to a few supply chain managers based in Singapore, and they're definitely looking at that. Not all countries can do that. Vietnam would obviously be one of the best places to do that. You can produce cheaply and efficiently, and the consumer market is small enough so that you can produce in excess of demand and then export those outside. But as I've said, I'm looking at the government responses all across the region, and it's not a very good picture. They will probably truly face a future of bouncing in and out of lockdowns, and that's going to be very problematic globally, precisely because of their impact on broader supply chains. We're probably also going to see the loss of a lot of international trade norms. Even before this lockdown, there are trade tensions that were invisible to the mainstream media. There was a trade war of sorts happening between Philippines and Thailand involving cars and tobacco exports around December, and the Philippines was threatening to increase tariffs on Thai exports and vice versa. So these things will come back worse, precisely because there's probably more justification to retaliate given the immense challenges domestically. And those things, if you add them up, plus politics, we've never seen a great a time when our leaders have never looked worse than today, is what I'm saying. And that's going to be going to add up to a scenario where, as you've said, a very bad economic prospect for the coming year.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dereck, Dr. Thuy, and Trang, for your insightful sharing so far. I will handle it back to Vũ, who will keep our Q&A session ongoing.
Yeah, thank you, Giang, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing your insights today. I'm just gonna go over the most upvoted questions, and we allow it to be interactive, so you have the chance to speak to the panelists. The first question is from Ming Fong to Ms. Trang. So I will unmute Ming. Ming, you are unmuted if you want to speak.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Dr. Thuy initially for your very insightful presentation, your deck about the health aspects. And my question is specifically for Ms. Thuy Trang from Macquarie. So basically, initially in March, you see like a mass liquidation that caused asset prices to fall very dramatically across all markets. And my question is capital flight from assets in Asia to US dollar denominated assets something that Asian investors should worry about? Thank you.
Thanks, Ming. Indeed, I mean, on March, what we did is looking at capital outflows across emerging Asia countries, and it was estimated that something in the order of 40 to 50 billion US dollar outflows that the region experienced on the month, which was the worst on record. Even during 08 and 09, it was something like 12 to 15 billion. So it's by far the worst. It's certainly something that investors that I have spoken to still worried about and are keeping in mind. However, at the same time, what we are seeing so far in April is that there has been some tentative recovery in those flows. It certainly have slowed in terms of the outflows, and we are seeing investors actually tentatively picking the bottoms, buying the cheap companies or buying government debts that providing high yields, even in the more vulnerable countries like Indonesia or India. So investors are taking a relatively optimistic assessment of the future, and that's in part a response to or reflecting government policy from the Fed down to the regional government that has been very, very supportive of a rebound eventually once the outbreak can be contained. Of course, you know, the drawback for this optimism is that we have seen equities coming back quite strongly. We have seen some of the Asia currencies recover half or even, you know, all of the sell-off from March, and valuations are not as attractive as it were. And if we indeed facing with a situation of repeated lockdown, government not handling subsequent waves of the crisis well, then we will face with a second wave of capital outflows in addition to a second wave of the virus outbreak. However, as usual, the first wave is normally the worst. This is because, you know, the first wave is amplified by various factors from positionings to leverage issues, and investor coming back tends to be, you know, having a more conservative risk profile or value at risk assessment. And so even though, you know, that further capital outflows will remain a risk, we think that, you know, it will be a lot less severe and more manageable. It's important to realize that Asia economies going into this crisis are in a generally better position than they were, say, back in Asia financial crisis in the 1998 or 1999. Most countries in our region, aside from Indonesia, India, and Philippines, have current account surplus, and inflation is very low. In addition, you know, all countries running on a flexible FX regime, so that acts as a very important shock absorber. So the economies may have been hit harder in the short term, but they also have the strength and the flexibility to rebound later on, especially if we do get to a treatment or a vaccination by early of next year.
Thank you, Chi. The next question is from Vinh Thanh Huang. And this is probably directed to Dereck and Trang.
Yeah, hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, thank you to all the panelists for taking the questions. Just to clarify, my name is Tang with the G at the end instead of H. It's just a typo. Anyway, I mean, just wanted to give a little bit more background about my question. I mean, it's I guess it's partially being answered already in what's been discussed up until now. But what I wanted to assess here is, you know, what is the perception, what is the relative perception of Vietnam compared to, let's say, other countries in the region? So I'm more interested in the relative instead of the absolute side of things, I guess. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I guess, you know, there are a few relative advantages that we have. The first is that, in fact, when we talk about supply chain relocations that Dereck has mentioned, the process has been ongoing even before, you know, the trade war. The trade war has certainly amplified it and accelerated it to some extent. But if you look at FDI investment into China, for example, it has been on a downtrend, in fact, since 2011. And if you look at from a global perspective, what we measure in terms of globalizations, we measure the foreign share value added as a percentage of total global trade. And that measure already peaked in 2008. So there has been a process of, you know, divergence, reshoring, localizations going on for some time now. But I guess a lot of it is to do with the cost advantage, and the tariff itself is a cost consideration because, you know, if you are exporting out from Vietnam or Taiwan, for example, you don't have to pay the additional tariffs if your final destination is the US. So Vietnam is recognized as having the cost advantage, and also the fact that we have built some infrastructures in terms of the supply chain, and our location geographically, that's where, you know, investors have rated highly in the surveys that we monitor. The disadvantage though is that we are also facing infrastructure bottlenecks in terms of logistics, in terms of roads, in terms of harbors, and those are the issues that the government will have to address. The other is that we have a relatively young population, and also we are highly entrepreneurs. We have a lot of small businesses, which, you know, in an environment where the country facing constraint from lockdown, the small businesses or the small e-commerce businesses can rebound relatively faster if they can take advantage of, you know, the advantage of being, you know, e-commerce and not social or direct services facing. And another advantage of Vietnam is obviously a stable political system. When you compare to other countries, and I'm sure Dereck has more to add, but we have a relatively stable political system compared to other countries, and policy stability is something that investors also rank quite highly in their survey. The drawback for us from a fiscal perspective is that we are also having issues in terms of banking system, in terms of government fiscal reserves. So that has prevented us from better capitalize our banks. And the current outbreak will certainly amplify this challenge because banks and companies are facing low cash flow, potentially higher solvency rate in this period. And if you don't have enough banks capital buffer, your whole credit channel is potentially impaired, which means that a lot of the government support measures, credit support from the central banks may not be able to pass through to the general or the smaller businesses. And you know, without the fiscal reserves or without the fiscal capability, that would be an issue for investors over the long term investing in Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, I have very little to add to that. I think that's super comprehensive. The pandemic has only accelerated the trends that we saw even before the trade war. Completely agree. That's what everyone kept telling us, manufacturers and private equity. We also think that Vietnam is in a very good position after this pandemic. I mean, if we're talking about the impact of this pandemic, I mean, that's certainly there. You know, the confidence regionally, globally on what Vietnam has achieved will probably help facilitate these investments. Having said that, talking to some of our clients, what they found to be the biggest challenge in operating in Vietnam or relocating there is the shortage of skilled labor. And that's precisely why you have hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers working in northern Vietnam. And that seems to be top of mind for the Vietnamese leadership. You have the new education law this year that would, you know, help move Vietnam's education system closer to what you have in places like Germany, with greater premium put on vocational skills and so on and so forth. That, I mean, that's very good news, but that would probably not kick in until, you know, 2-3 years down the road. You have energy problems as well, but again, I see that the Vietnamese leadership has been very, very cognizant of that, including by allowing some of the experts to come to Vietnam already. I know that there was a chartered flight from the UK to Hanoi precisely because ferrying some of these technical experts who would now work on energy projects. So I mean, you see a very responsive government is my point in Vietnam, and that's not at all what you see elsewhere in the region, because you have the Philippines. I mean, you know, relocation from China, you'd probably consider the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and probably to a lesser extent Myanmar. And the politics there don't look good. I can talk for hours for the reasons why they don't look good, but that's the biggest advantage that Vietnam has. I mean, the Communist Party is not perfect, but it's certainly more responsive to investor needs, is my point.
Thank you, Trang and Dereck. We're going to move on to the next question, which is started for Dr. Thuy. I'm going to unmute Nguyen, and would you mind asking that question about vaccine that you posted?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us and share your insights. But I'm wondering from a public policy perspective about the challenges of manufacturing and distributing on such a large scale basis of any potential vaccine or cure. So how do you think policymakers and governments can work with whatever corporation that puts forth these, you know, cures or vaccine with the potential manufacturing and distribution issues?
Thank you, Nguyen, for your question. I think that it is the global issues, not only the country issues. And I'm aware that the global organizations such as Gavi, which providing support in procurement and supply chain for various kind of vaccines to different countries, is stepping in the process, try to help the process to coordinate the distribution of the vaccine if it is available in the coming months to different countries, and they are developing plan. I haven't seen such plan, and I haven't been involved in any discussion related to this plan, but I believe that each country should also have their own plan on how to procure, how to compete with other countries, and how to get the vaccine into the country and disperse it. So far in Vietnam, I haven't seen such plan, and my research group has again a plan to work with Ministry of Health to develop some kind of action to prepare for that. But at this moment, this is very difficult, not only with vaccine, but even the test kit we are trying to procure from other countries is so difficult to compete with the big country with big money who is willing to pay with high price. I'm sitting here and still negotiating with the seller to buy test kit for Vietnam. I'm still failed for a few weeks till now. So it's quite difficult for Asian countries. What I hope is Asian country can take on and produce vaccine by itself. And we do have a positive side to believe that, for example, Vietnam used to be able to develop vaccine for the country itself. So the government now is pushing and investing on the technology to explore if we can produce such vaccines in country. I hope I answer your question.
Thank you, Dr. Thuy. Going to move on to the next question by Tung Do. I'm going to unmute you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name is Tung Do, and I work in M&A in Singapore. So I'm particularly interested in the M&A's activities. So my question to the guest speaker is, when do you think the cross-border M&A activities will resume to its peak in Southeast Asia? Yeah. And thank you very much to all of the guest speaker and VFS for organizing this webinar today. Yeah, thank you very much.
I guess I jump in on this one. I'm not an M&A specialist for sure, but what I can say is that it will take a long time to resume back to the previous peak. Even from an economic perspective, we are talking about very sharp slowdown or very sharp contraction in global growth this year. And we say that because of that low base, you could get growth above trend next year in a lot of the economies. However, if you look at level terms, in order for us to come back to the level pre-outbreak, it may take years. So for example, if you look at the unemployment rate or industrial production in the US, it took 6 to 10 years in 2008 to go back to the level before GFC. So same for M&A flow. I think, you know, if you're looking for a return of the peak, it probably takes some time. Also, a lot of the constraint in M&A, you know, requires international flow, business travel to be relaxed as well, and that could be the constraint. It's difficult to do business due diligence in this environment where, you know, you just have to meet offline or online to do the process. In the short term, you may see a bounce. This is because companies those who have cash may be looking at very attractive opportunities that they had looked at before. So you may have a small bounce in that sense. But generally, global corporates are taking a more conservative stance and are trying to preserve liquidities in this environment. Shareholders are also not likely to reward aggressive M&A at this stage, given so much uncertainty and so much uncertainty about the dividend payment itself. So my personal view is you may see a small bounce, but in order for activity to come back to the previous peak, what you probably need is a relatively high confidence of the treatment or vaccination, as well as significant easing of international travel flow and normalization of economic activity.
Thank you, Trang. Dereck, you have anything to add to that point?
No, we don't. We don't really do that at our firm. Deal with M&A, but we do get the same sense that all these activities will probably be experiencing a slump over the coming months.
Thank you. The next and the last question from the audience is from Andrew Rowan, and that question is for Dr. Thuy.
Thanks, Vu, and thanks to the panelists for sharing your views and to VFS for organizing this event. I have the pleasure of joining from Mexico, so I can definitely relate to some of the supply chain shocks that Dereck mentioned. There's a lot of pressure from US officials to open things up here as quickly as possible, although the peak is supposed to arrive in about a week or so. My question for Dr. Thuy is about the test kits that you mentioned. I'd like to know the general reliability of the single tests and rapid tests, IgG and IgM for the antibodies. There have been widespread reports about faulty tests and the lack of accurate test results, especially for tests that have gone into the US, for example. And so I wanted to know if you had any information about the reliability of the tests, and if that is one of the considerations, as you mentioned, you were negotiating with vendors.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew, for your question. And it's a very tough question at this moment. There's contradictory findings about different antibody tests used in different contexts, and that mostly related to the uncertainty, understanding about how the virus create antibody in the human being and how long the antibody will stay. The most recent study indicate that the antibody may appear after 20 days from infection. So if we use antibody tests before 20 days, we will not likely to find out the antibody. So the test might be false negative. Perhaps I'm talking a bit technical, but what I mean is the test has to be used in the right time with the right population in order to increase the specificity and sensitivity of the test. Secondly, there are so many tests produced and manufactured at this moment, and I haven't seen any mechanism to evaluate which test should be used in different countries. WHO hasn't approved for any antibody test at this moment, which means that we still have to wait for quite a long time. I've seen some study using 10 or 20 antibody tests and compare to each other, which shows some candidate has high sensitivity and specificity. But I still prefer to wait a bit longer to have more evidence rather than rush and use inappropriate tests to draw inappropriate conclusion. Sorry, I cannot give a more positive and specific answer to your question.
Right. Thank you very much to our speaker and our audience for a very productive Q&A sessions. The Q&A session will now close, and we will now move to the closing thought from our guest speaker. Maybe, like, if you don't mind, can you please share with us like one long-lasting change, even permanent change, that you think this coronavirus pandemic will bring to our world, like in all the patterns that you will see? What is the one thing that will be permanently changed? We start with Dr. Thuy first.
Thank you. That I take the first position is easier always. I think that everything will change. How we live, how we work, how we do healthcare. I'm not economist, so I cannot say about that, but certainly everything will change, and in healthcare we'll have to be better in preparing for a future pandemic, not SARS-CoV-2, but potentially another pandemic, to protect people's health and taking advantage of the technology and science development during this pandemic to prepare better.
Thank you, Dr. Thuy. Chicha.
It's a pretty tough question. Many things are going to change. But I guess I would focus on consumer behavior change. Many of us already, I guess the younger population's already accustomed to e-commerce amongst other things. But I guess after this, you will see, a further acceleration of that trend. And also through this outbreak, what we understand is that technology plays a very important role, not only, in terms of facilitate normal life or reduce the disruptions in the sense that, you can't go to the supermarket, but at least you can order your food back to your home. You can't go to your office, but you can work almost seamlessly from home. So all of this will accelerate the change that technology will bring to our life. And we were already at the early stage of 5G development in a lot of the countries from China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. I think we will further seeing a relaunch of that once the shutdown measure ease. And that should further, change the way that technology penetrates our lives.
I guess it's me left. I'll focus, I guess, on a more political answer. And I think the biggest one is that big government is back. In the same way that the world wars brought about, the greatest expansion of the state sector. I think that will happen as well in this case. In the same way that the 9/11 incident change how, our experience with going to an airport, going to a building, and so on and so forth. That's probably going to happen. Universal basic income, ideas like that will receive greater acceptance in the industrialized world, and versions of it will probably be rolled out in big developing countries as well, with huge savings. So that's my answer. The relationship between the public sector and the private sector that will change drastically to fill in gaps in both demand and supply, as I've mentioned earlier, but also to manage unrest and security challenges that will come about in most developing countries.
Thank you very much, Dereck. With that, with those closing thoughts from our guest speaker, we have reached the end of our webinar event today. Again, on behalf of VFS, I would like to express our gratitude for our guest speaker and our audience. Hope everyone have raised some insight from this webinar, and VFS look forward to organizing more events for the community during this period. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Yes, you too.